The Entrepreneur's Library, episode 101.
Welcome to the Entrepreneur's Library, the only book-centric podcast that reviews all the top-selling business books and shares authors' perspective firsthand. This is your resource to finding the next great book that will enable you to grow personally and professionally. Welcome your host, Wade Danielson.
Welcome back to the EL. As a reminder for those of you that missed the last episode, we're now giving away a book per episode. So 5 days a week, we're giving away the book that we actually talk about that episode. So today we're going to be talking with Ron Friedman, author of The Best Place to Work. And if you want an opportunity to win that book, check out the elpodcast.com. And in the upper right-hand corner, there's a button that says Become a VIP. So if you click there, you have an opportunity to win that book. Welcome, Ron, and thank you for joining us on the Entrepreneur's Library.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Will you take just a moment to introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about you personally?
Sure. My name is Ron Friedman. I'm a social psychologist, and I specialize in human motivation. I've taught at the University of Rochester, Hobart and William Smith, Nazareth College, and I write for the Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Forbes. I've also founded a company called Ignite 80 that helps smart leaders build extraordinary workplaces. And the way we do that is via speaking and workshops and occasionally some consulting. And if you're wondering about the name of that company, it's because 80% of employees worldwide have been found to be disengaged at work. So we look to correct that. And finally, I'm the author of a new book called The Best Place to Work, The Art and Science of Creating an Extraordinary Workplace.
Perfect. Ron, thank you for sharing that. And that company that you said you started, I might ask you to bring that up again at the end, as far as not only to put it on a resource page, but there might be an opportunity for you to help several people that are listening improve their workplace. And so
Sure,
I'll ask you to bring that up again towards the end. But you did kind of my job for me right here, because I want to jump into your book, The Best Place to Work. And I did forget to say the next part in the intro, so I will say it again, even though you just did. The Art and Science of Creating an Extraordinary Workplace. And the book was actually not just made, but about to be made available December 2nd, 2014. And Ron, we're going to move quickly, but we're going to cover only the top questions that our listener/reader wants to get answered. And the first one is, what was the inspiration behind writing The Best Place to Work?
Well, one of the things I talk about in the book is that the book really happened by accident. I spent years in academics studying human motivation and teaching psychology courses in colleges and universities. And my goal was always to become a full-time professor. And eventually I achieved that goal, and I got a full-time teaching job. And when I got there, I found myself itching for a new challenge. Being an instructor, it's a really kind of fun role. But the way I describe it, it's kind of like being in a really good class and then being in that same class every day for the rest of your life. And so if you got into academics for the reasons I did, it was to learn new things. And as a professor, you're really kind of covering the same material again and again. So I wanted that new challenge. And so I decided to go off into the corporate world, where I was hired to work as a pollster, measure public opinion. And it was a really eye-opening experience, because what I noticed when I got to the corporate world is that a lot of the things that I took for granted as a psychology professor, I kind of assumed everyone knew the conditions that foster engagement and creativity and peak performance. But when I got to the corporate world, I witnessed a real disconnect. Everything from the way that companies hire, to the way that managers motivate, to the design and layout of the modern office appeared blind to a wealth of research. And it's certainly not for a lack of interest. It's not that managers or CEOs are not interested in getting their employees more engaged and creating the conditions that foster peak performance. It's more of the fact that all of this information that academics have uncovered has remained hidden behind layers of jargon. And so I wrote this book to bridge the gap, because I got to meet a lot of these business owners and a lot of entrepreneurs who are really interested in building great workplaces and just don't have the tools for doing that.
So, Ron, there's a couple books. There's not too many, but there's a couple books that cover this same topic. And so, this next question: will you take some time to differentiate and tell us what makes your book different than those that are out on a similar or same topic?
Well, I would say two major differences. And one is that this is a really integrative work. And what I mean by that is I've set out to write a book, really the most comprehensive book on workplace psychology that's ever been written for a popular audience. So I recognize what it's like to be an entrepreneur because I'm an entrepreneur myself, and I wanted to write kind of a user's guide for someone who's busy. So I've taken thousands of peer-reviewed academic articles, chapters, books, textbooks, and I've condensed them down into a story-driven narrative. And one of the ways that the book is being marketed is you can pore over thousands of academic articles, or now you can read just one book. And I really believe that's true. There are a number of books on the market that try to do the same thing for different topics. Like, for example, if you're familiar with Dan Pink's To Sell is Human, I think that's a great book on the principles of sales. Really summarizes a lot of the research in a really effective manner. The same for Josh Kaufman's The Portable MBA. So summarizes a lot of the principles of business. The Best Place to Work aims to do that for the science of the workplace. And the second way I think the book is different is that it's focused on being really action-driven. I wanted to provide a lot of action items. As someone who's spent years in the trenches, I realize entrepreneurs don't have time for theory. And the mark of a good consultant is not someone who tells you a good story. It's someone who tells you what to do about it. And I realize entrepreneurs need action items, and this book is really stocked with action items, both for managers and for employees.
So, Ron, how would you suggest the reader engage with your book? Did you write this in a way that they can jump in and out based on what they need? Or is this really one they should start and read all the way through?
This is really a buffet of different ideas. Every chapter in the book is focused on a different aspect of the workplace. So I have a list here. All told, I would say the book summarizes, just a wide range of different topics. So it covers the fundamentals of work motivation, the psychology of failure, feedback, rewards, recognition, creativity, flow, office design, colleague friendships, gossip, pride, the psychology of hiring, the psychology of titles, organizational culture. And you can certainly skip around and go in. I would say, this is the kind of book that you could even read 5 minutes of at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day just to get yourself thinking. And you can, find a section on why exercise makes you smarter, or how to ask interview questions that reveal people's true potential, or even how FBI hostage negotiators diffuse tensions and how you can apply those principles to the way that you conduct your workplace conversations. So it really is a variety of different topics and not one that you have to read in a linear fashion.
All right, now that we know the background behind the book, let's take a deep dive into the actual content. Will you take the next 5 to 10 minutes and really give the reader/listener a great idea of what your book is all about?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, this book really is a journey of different topics on the psychology of the workplace. So as you can imagine, summarizing thousands of studies in 10 minutes would be a real challenge. So what I'd like to do is, I mentioned earlier the gaps that I saw when I got to the workplace, and 3 in particular. And let me address each one and tell you a little bit about some of the interesting findings in the book. So the first one was how organizations hire. Now, if you're looking to grow a business, you're going to be doing some hiring. And regardless of how well you structure your workplace, if you don't get the right people in your organization, it's just not going to be effective. So how do most organizations hire? Well, one of the critical pieces is the in-person interview. And as it turns out, there's plenty of research showing that these interviews are not a very effective tool for predicting how good someone is going to be in a particular role. So the reason that we have this kind of these in-person interviews are not all that effective is because we have all of these cognitive biases that prevent us from actually measuring someone's effectiveness for the role we're looking to fill. So I talk in the book about research showing that we tend to favor good-looking people. Good-looking people are automatically viewed. There's this halo effect that happens. You see someone who's good-looking, you assume that they're also competent. So if you have 2 people applying for a role, and it may be frankly unconscious, is you're going to have you're going to favor the better looking person, and that interferes with you selecting the best individual. Another bias is tall, and it's funny, it's kind of obvious the looks, but then there are other features like tall people tend to be viewed as having greater leadership potential. So there's a study I talk about in the book where they showed participants an image of a 5'4" individual and of a 6'4" individual, and it was the same person. They had just modified it using Photoshop, and they had participants rate that individual's leadership ability, and the taller individual was viewed as having greater leadership skill. Deep-voiced candidates are viewed as more trustworthy. So if you think about when you watch a movie, who the narrator is, it's often this kind of it's a deep-voiced individual, not Pee Wee Herman, and it's because that provides this trustworthiness, this comfort level that we have around listening to someone who has that voice. And all of these impressions affect not just the way that we view that candidate, but also the questions that we ask as a result. So, for example, if I'm meeting an individual and I assume that they're extroverted based on their appearance, I might ask them a question like, tell me about your experience leading groups. But if I have a different impression of that same individual, and let's say I view them as maybe shy or introverted, I might ask a slightly different question like, are you comfortable leading groups? Now, obviously, they're both addressing the same type of information, but that slight change in wording impacts the response you get. And that, in turn, creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where you view someone a certain way at the beginning of the interview and they end up acting that way as a result. Then there are all other types of biases that I talk about, like, for example, we tend to favor people who remind us of ourselves. So if you're interviewing somebody who grew up in your hometown, or someone who went to your alma mater, someone who happens to like reading the same business books as you, you're going to like that candidate more than the alternatives, and not necessarily because that person is more qualified. So I talk about all of the biases, and I've just given you a flavor for some of them, and then I talk about ways that entrepreneurs can correct for those, like, for example, creating what I call a blind audition, and that is, rather than interviewing someone based on how well they speak and how effective they are at interpersonal skill, create an audition where they can do the task that is actually required of them. So, for example, if you're hiring a designer, have them mock up a website for you. If you're hiring a writer, have them write a blog for you. And then that way, you're creating your impression of that individual on the job-relevant skills that they're going to have to deliver for you, rather than simply choosing that person because you happen to get along. I also talk about asking a lot of behavioral focused questions. So don't ask people what they believe or about their philosophy. That's kind of interesting, but it's not all that relevant to how competent they're going to be for you when you hire them. So instead, identify some specific situations in their pasts, talk about a problem they've had with a manager and how they overcame it, or identify some activities they're going to be doing for you and ask them how they're going to approach them. Past behavior predicts future behavior. So by focusing your interview questions on how someone has acted in the past or intends to act in the future, you're going to get a better sense for that person's abilities. Taking notes during the interview. Our memories for events tend to be strongest at the beginning and the end of an interaction, and they're not very good for the middle of the interaction. So if you're taking notes during your interview, you're going to have a clearer picture at the end of it of whether or not the person was qualified. So these are just some of the ideas around interviewing, and I've just given you a flavor for it, rather than explaining the entire chapter, but there's a lot about how to be better at selecting people to make sure you're building your organization the right way. A second gap is how managers motivate. So there's another thing that I came to find during my experience is that, you go to organizations and what's the primary mode of motivation? There's obviously salaries, bonuses. A lot of times they're Employee of the Month awards, even in organizations not, outside of retail. This is something that actually does exist in a lot of companies. And people try to motivate you with impressive job titles. And obviously there's the implicit fear of losing your job. So I'm sure all your listeners are aware, these are examples of extrinsic rewards, and extrinsic rewards can certainly be motivating. The trouble is they're not all that effective at sustaining engagement over the long term. So in the book, I present a completely different frame for thinking about engagement in a section on what video games teach us about creating an extraordinary workplace. So if you think about your experience playing video games, and I think just about everybody has played, for example, Tetris. You get sucked into these games doing a whole host of behaviors that you would normally avoid, right? So you start sorting cards, you're rotating falling in solitaire, you're rotating falling blocks in Tetris. If you played Angry Birds, you know what it's like to anguish over defeating a cartoon villain. And we engage in all of these behaviors at considerable personal cost. So we ignore bedtimes, meals are skipped, weekends disappear. And what's really fascinating fascinating about video games is that we don't get paid to do this, right? We don't get paid to not sleep, to play these fictional characters or get these points that don't count for anything. So the question is why? What is it that's engaging to us about video games that maybe we can learn from and apply to the workplace? And some things that I talk about are, I think the reason that we find these games as enjoyable as we do is because they deliver the very experiences that we seek in our workplace. For example, we have a clear set of goals. We know exactly what our objectives are. We get immediate feedback on whether or not we've done it well. We get recognized when we succeed. We have an opportunity to grow our competence as we're engaging in these games. And then finally, and this is critical, progressive difficulty. So what I mean by that is these games get harder the longer you play. And as a result of that, you're continuing to build new skills and you're pushing yourself, and that engages you. At most workplaces, it's the opposite, where after a few years, the job gets easier and easier and easier, and it's hard to sustain your engagement unless you're growing. So I think the key takeaway here is that, number one, engagement isn't about the task. It's not about the actual job. It's about the conditions that we build around it. So if we can introduce a clear set of goals, immediate feedback, provide recognition, an opportunity for people to grow, and then progressive difficulty, you're going to see engagement. And so, if you when you fulfill people's psychological needs, any activity can become a passion. And I think that's really critical for people to consider as they think about designing the roles that they're hiring people to do. And then the last one I'll give you is the gap in workplace design. So this is another thing that I noticed. So within the book, I survey all of the research on office design, the psychology of how our minds react differently to different environments. And what I argue is that there's a connection between space and innovation. So what I mean by that is where we are affects the way we think. So I think in a lot of ways that's kind of something that we should provide. We should consider a little bit more closely. So it seems kind of obvious that the way that we think, scrunched up in an elevator, is very different than the way that we think in the wide, airy spaces of a museum. But we don't often consider that when we decide where we want to work, and I think we should. There's research that I cover in the book looking at how height of a room, the ceiling height, affects our ability to think abstractly. So there's studies showing that in a room with taller ceilings, people become a little bit better at abstract thinking than in a room with tighter quarters. There's studies on furniture and attitude. So when people enter a room with chairs that are arranged in a circle, they tend to become more focused on intergroup belonging. And what is it like in most conference rooms? A lot of conference rooms have sharper angles. And studies show that in those types of rooms, people become more individualistic. So knowing about the research and then deciding how you want to shape the rooms that you're having people interact with can be really useful. And so the room's layout in a lot of these instances is communicating the type of interaction that's expected. And so that's part of why when we enter a room with chairs arranged in a circle, we start thinking about other group members. And that can be useful or not so useful depending on the task, but knowing that can help you determine what's the right setting for your office. There's also studies showing that the actual makeup of the furniture in the room can also impact the way that we think when we're working in there. So chairs that have more rigid backs, like wooden chairs, that tends to make people a little bit more rigid, but more flexible chairs with soft cushions, for example, that makes people more willing to compromise. There's research on sound and creativity, so we tend to be a little bit more creative when there's a little bit of a hum around us, which is why coffee shops are renowned for writers as being kind of like the place you go to when you want to write. And it's kind of fascinating to think about because you'd think you'd want absolute silence, but not necessarily if you're looking to generate some creative solutions. So I discuss all the ways that companies can leverage a lot of these insights to deliver a better working environment. And so I think I've summarized just about 10% of the material in the book, and I hope it's given you a good sense of what I mean by the gap between the latest science and the modern workplace.
No, you did a phenomenal job, and I like the way that you broke it down into those three main topics. And now this next question is a way that we're going to take it even a step further and ask that you really break it down into, if the reader could only take away one concept, principle, or action item, we're basically asking, what would you want that to be?
Man, that's tough. Just saying one thing is going to be hard because this covers a lot. So let me try to push. If you don't mind, I'm going to give you three. So three key takeaways. One is psychological needs are at the heart of employee engagement. If you're looking to create an engaged workforce, you need to provide people with psychologically fulfilling experiences. And what I mean by that is enabling them to feel competent at the work that they do and allowing them some learning experiences along the way. Number two is helping them connect with their colleagues in a meaningful fashion. And number three is allowing them to experience choice in the way that they do their work. So rather than as a manager, rather than simply saying, here's how we're going to do it, identify the outcomes, but let your employees figure out the process for themselves, because that'll allow them to feel more autonomous in the work that they do. And as a result of that, they're going to be more engaged. The second takeaway is that organizations are a lot more successful when they address rather than ignore the limits of both the mind and the body. And, we are human beings. We are not machines. We have limited mental bandwidth. And we require restorative experiences like taking a midday walk, exercising, even napping. I talk about in the book about the research showing the benefits of taking regular naps and how a lot of organizations are applying those insights to get some better performance. So to produce our best work, we really need to take into account the fact that we cannot work nonstop at the same rate. And that we really do need to provide opportunities for employees to restock their mental energy if we want to achieve top performance. And then finally, the third key takeaway is that rather than encouraging employees to find work-life balance, which I heard a lot of when I was in the corporate world, organizations can be a lot more successful by allowing employees to integrate the two aspects of their life and in an active way. And so what I mean by that is involving significant others in after work activities, connecting the organizations to nonprofits in the community. And I also provide a lot of examples of companies that, rather than just rewarding the employee, are expressing appreciation directly to the employee's family as a means of helping the entire family feel like they're part of the organization, because what that does is that helps elevate the feeling of status that the employee has. They can take a lot more pride in the company when they treat not just the employee well, but they treat their family well as well.
Again, those are three major points. And man, I'd love to ask some additional questions, and I might have to after the actual interview. But this next question that they have is, do you have a favorite quote from your book?
I do. And one of the chapters of the book, it covers the research on in the literature on creative geniuses. So people like Shakespeare and Mozart and Dickens, what's different about them? And we talk about a lot of different things that they do differently, but the one that really stands out is, and for me, this is one of the most fascinating differentiators, is that they fail more often. And here's what I mean by that. Shakespeare, if you look at Shakespeare, Mozart, and Dickens, they all produced more than their counterparts. Now, we remember them for a mere fraction of their complete body of work. So another way of saying that is that highly successful people actually fail more often than the average person. And it's a wildly kind of counterintuitive idea, but it holds true in a variety of industries. And I talk about it in the book. Is in baseball, the player with the most career strikeouts, Reggie Jackson, Hall of Famer. In basketball, the player with the most missed shots, Kobe Bryant. In football, the player with the most interceptions, Brett Favre. And, it's also true for industry. So you look at Steve Jobs, he had a long run of failures before the iPod and the iPad. Apple I, Apple II, Lisa were not considered successes. Thomas Edison wasted decades trying to extract iron out of sand and lost a fortune doing it. Excuse me. And then finally, Google. You look at Google, right? So Google Wave, Google X, Google Buzz, Frugal, all of these are failed projects that helped Google get to where they are. So the quote in the book is, when your attempt rate is high, each individual failure becomes a lot less significant. And what I mean by that is, to be successful, you need to take risks. And if you're going to take risks, you need to be willing to fail. So I think that's a mantra that really any entrepreneur can take to be more successful, is get comfortable with failure, because the more you do of it and the more you explore the reasons behind the failure and how you can improve, the better off you'll be.
I love that you brought up failure. It's one of my favorite topics. You would think it wouldn't be, but one of my favorite topics and one of my favorite books, Failing Forward, is always talking about really it's how you see failure in the first place that matters, and then what you do with it. But yes, exactly what you were just talking about, that the failure is on the road to success, where a lot of people think that you're trying to avoid it. So I love the fact that you brought that up. And
I appreciate you saying that. I haven't read Failing Forward, but it sounds like it's a book I should pick up. The first chapter in the book is actually Success is Overrated, Why Great Workplaces Reward Failure. And it's about rewarding the attempts, not the outcomes. If you're looking for a great product, you've got to encourage your employees to take risks. And the way you do that is not by simply recognizing people when they succeed, but recognizing them for taking that extra step of trying something new.
So I just mentioned a book that's one of my favorites, Failing Forward. And now I want to ask the same thing from you. I want to be able to grab a book that and again, we're not just asking for any book. We're looking for a book that was a paradigm-shifting, life-impacting book. Do you have one that you can recommend to our audience?
Well, in the spirit of giving you more than you asked for, I'm going to give you two books.
Okay.
The first one, these are books I would say any entrepreneur would benefit from reading. One is, and I would imagine a lot of your listeners have read this, is Getting Things Done by David Allen. And one of the things he talks about in that book is this idea of externalizing as much information as you can so that you can focus on one idea at a time. So in other words, and I've adopted a lot of these practices myself. So for example, when I'm reading a book or an article, a lot of times ideas will pop into my head and I'll want to go and jump on the computer, send someone a quick email or remember to do something later. And the best way to get that idea out of your head so that you can focus to the work in front of you is to write it down. So what I do now is, in other words, externalize the information so it's not weighing on your conscious attention. So when I read, I'll keep a notepad next to me, and it's not for summarizing the key points of what I've read. It's for all that other garbage that pops into my head so that I can actually focus on what I'm doing. And I think in Getting Things Done, David Allen talks a lot about focusing your attention one idea at a time by externalizing information that isn't relevant. And I think it's why unitasking, we talk a lot about multitasking, but I think unitasking is about to become all the rage, where more and more people are starting to recognize all of the research around how much more focused we can be by attending to one task at a time. And then the second book that I would highly recommend for all entrepreneurs is The Accidental Creative by Todd Henry. And in that book, Todd Henry talks a lot about different practices that really anyone can apply to improve their performance no matter what they do. And it was a very impactful book for me, and I think it would be for a lot of your readers as well.
Excellent. Thank you for sharing both of those. We actually had an opportunity to get David Allen on. I believe it was episode 19, and to talk about getting things done. And I believe he actually has, I think it's a new edition. I think he's updated it. That'll be coming out February, March timeframe. I guess don't quote me on that, but a new edition of it, kind of an updated version. So I'm excited for that to come out and read what else he's put in that. But Ron, thank you so much for coming on today. But I do want to ask, before we depart, can you recommend the best way for our listener to get more information on you and your new book? And again, I would like to, if you have something to offer product-wise, I always say this, that this is a plug-away zone. So if you have something that our audience can get, huge value out of, please bring it up.
Well, you can find out more about the research that I do, and you can pick up, you can access a lot of the articles I've written for Harvard Business Review and Fast Company and some other outlets at ignite80.com. And it's the number 80, Ignite 80. And you can also sign up for my mailing list, and I'd be happy to send you articles as they come out so that you can pick up on some of these practices and put them to use in your life.
Excellent. Well, again, Ron, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your book with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening in today. If you'd like to get more information on Ron or his book, The Best Place to Work, look at the show notes at theelpodcast.com.
Looking for your next book idea? Head over to theelpodcast.com, where Wade shares his amazing resource, the top 10 business books recommended by over 500 entrepreneurs, with you for free. That's theelpodcast.com. Till the next time, keep it on the EL.